Well, joining me now in Mexico City is Carolina Jimenez, who's Amnesty International's Deputy Director for the Americas. She led the team behind the report. Carolina, good to have you on the Newsmakers. Extrajudicial executions, possible crimes against humanity, big accusations against Maduro's government. Do you have the evidence to back it up at Amnesty?
We certainly do. We have been documenting serious human rights violations in Venezuela since at least 2014. Extrajudicial executions, arbitrary detentions, torture, or other forms of cruel and inhuman treatment are not new in Venezuela. What we did find out is that in January 2019, this strategy of repression intensified. We sent a team of researchers who travel around Venezuela documenting especially the extrajudicial executions that were committed, and found enough evidence, forensic evidence, legal texts. We review the information available. We requested information from the authorities, and of course we interviewed many victims and witnesses, and found that the attacks against civilian population, against people that are dissidents or perceived as such by the Maduro government, constitute what may be indeed crimes against humanity. And as you say, these are very serious allegations that we make after many years working with victims in documenting human rights violations in the country.
Carolina, who's doing the killing? Who's actually killing these people?
In the case of the repression we saw in January, from the 21st to the 25th of January specifically, mainly security forces under the command of Nicolas Maduro, but also irregular armed groups acting on behalf of or in coordination with these security forces, what are known as colectivos in Venezuela. The National Bolivarian Police has a special unit called FAES in Spanish, which has become really a very criminal and a highly lethal unit to repress people and actually to commit extrajudicial executions. So we found that out of 47 deaths reported during the demonstrations, at least 39 can be attributed to security forces and to irregular groups working on behalf of the government, specifically the FAES, the special forces of the national.
And Carolina, as far as I understand, Amnesty wants the UN Human Rights Council to establish a commission of inquiry. I'm going to go into that more in depth a little bit later on. Stay where you are. Let's broaden out this discussion with political activist Francisco Marquez Lara from Washington, D.C. He was jailed in Venezuela in 2016 while working for the opposition, and then forced into exile in the US. And in Caracas, we have Paul Dobson. He's a journalist at Venezuela Analysis. Good to have you both joining the conversation. Paul Dobson, you heard me talk to Carolina there. Carolina's still online. Do you have anything that you might disagree with her on?
Well, I think first and foremost, Imran, here in Venezuela, without a doubt, there have been instances of police authorities which have exceeded their mandate in terms of using force against the civilian population. This is a reality. This is a reality in nearly every country in the world. In fact, if we look at this, we couldn't find a single country which doesn't have any sort of cases of this. However, I think it's also important to take into account or to point out that there are serious violations of human rights here in Venezuela committed by both the leaders and the supporters of the opposition, which seems very surprising to me, don't appear in this report by Amnesty International. When we're looking at this objectively, as we should do, given the seriousness of this issue, I think we really have to both obviously look at the irregularities from the state security forces, but also look at the irregularities by the opposition politicians and their supporters. For example, where I live, a disabled man was burnt alive by opposition supporters. This doesn't appear in Amnesty's report.
Okay, interesting point. Before I bring Francisco in, Carolina, has Amnesty deliberately, blatantly ignored the crimes of the opposition?
Some clarifications are necessary, and Paul, you are a journalist, so I think it's important that we provide the information with the right and strict legal standards that should apply when we talk about human rights. The responsibility and the obligation to fulfill to guarantee and to protect human rights belongs to the government. So we call on the government to protect and to respect these rights. If the opposition is indeed committing crimes, then there should be investigations, prompt and impartial investigations around these alleged crimes. Secondly, there are no instances in which the police commit abuses. This is a pattern. That's why we're calling them possible crimes against humanity, because the pattern repeats itself in the different cycles of demonstration that the country has experienced since 2014. So see, these are no random instances of violence. This is a well-organized action by the government of Maduro to silence dissidents and to commit multiple human rights violations in different states and in different parts of the country, especially these days in low-income areas, in poor neighborhoods, against poor citizens.
Okay. Francisco Marquez Lara, how do you feel about Amnesty's report?
Well, I think they're spot on. I personally witnessed 2 torture sessions. I saw it. It's not a report. Nobody told me about it. I personally met when I was in prison with a person that lost their eye because of all the electrocution that they faced. A person who was damaged psychologically for a long time. So it's a shame that Paul minimizes the suffering of the Venezuelan people by describing instances. This is systematic. This is widespread. You don't get 1,000 political prisoners if it's not systematic. That's not the case in any other Latin American country. You don't get 25% of the National Assembly Democratic Forces persecuted if it's not widespread or systematic, or 600 cases of torture, or hundreds of cases of violation or rape for political reasons. So this is not some instance. Right. And really what we're seeing in Venezuela, and this is very unfortunate, you're seeing a war of the regime against its people that translates to millions of people leaving, the largest migration crisis, refugee crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere. People dying because they can't have cancer or HIV treatment. Families every single night have to decide which child gets to eat because the parents definitely can't do so. So I think to describe this as instances or trying to minimize it is completely and flat out wrong. Okay. And it's really problematic when I think in so-called independent institutions try and do this.
Right. So Paul Dobson, it's interesting because Amnesty is not saying that Maduro has no legitimacy. Amnesty is not saying that they recognize Guaido as the legitimate leader, as 50 countries do, right? Amnesty is saying you are the government, you have the responsibility to look after your people, and this is happening on your watch. That's why it's systematic. That's why we're going to hold you to account for this. That's fair, isn't it?
To some extent, yes. There are also elements which I think, well, I would have liked to have seen in this report, which include, for example, the amount of policemen who have been processed by the legal authorities in Venezuela for having committed an excess of force in their responsibilities. The government here have opened a truth commission, and a number of policemen have been arrested and have been detained because of their heavy-handedness in these instances. And I think this is perfectly correct. And this also needs to be recognized. That there's more to do, yes, without a doubt. But I think we also have to recognize that the government have at least publicly recognized that there have been irregularities.
So let me ask Francisco. Francisco, do you trust the government's truth commission?
Absolutely not. And what I think people are missing here is people have been in the regime, not the government, in the regime, when someone violates human rights, they get promoted. They don't get sanctioned. People who have been sanctioned by Europe, Canada, and the US for systematic human rights violations have become ministers. And they actually, in Venezuela, Maduro does this whole award situation. And I could tell you, not just from a institutional level, but from a personal perspective, the director of the prisoner that tortured 2 people in front of me for half-hour sessions, he said to me, when you get out there, make sure you say all the horrible things and you describe all the horrible things you saw. That way, I will be promoted. That way, I will have a good grace by the guys up top. That's the way it is seen inside the regime. Right now, we have a new director of intelligence that has been widely known to continually torture people in our intelligence prison. So really, you can, I'm sure, cherry pick some instances where the regime has imprisoned policemen, but at the end of the day, most of the people that get sanctioned, or I'm sorry, most of the people that get imprisoned are democratic activists. That's the truth. And if you do mess with the democratic activists, if you do murder, if you do torture, you get promoted. And those are the facts.
Carolina, Amnesty recommending the UN Human Rights Council do something about this and establish a commission. That's going to be quite impossible right now, isn't it? Because of the political game that's at play and the two camps, right? It's politically fractured, and some powers support Guaido and some Maduro.
Well, we are recommending indeed the establishment of a commission of inquiry under the mandate of the Human Rights Council, and we hope the situation in the Human Rights Council is less politicized than what we have seen in the Security Council. On the other hand, I think there is general agreement that the international community must act around Venezuela. I mean, as Francisco was saying, we're witnessing one of the worst, if not the worst, refugee crisis in the history of the American continent. So this is affecting many, many countries directly, and therefore there is political will to act around what is happening. We believe a commission of inquiry is necessary basically because access to justice in Venezuela has become impossible. The justice system is not only inefficient, it's politicized. It responds to the orders of the executive, which is why I actually disagree with what Paul was saying. There are very, very few cases when policemen are prosecuted. When attacks are systematic and widespread, you need much more than a few arrests of policemen. You need a real change in the way law enforcement works, especially when crimes against humanity may have been committed. So we trust the Human Rights Council will do the right thing and will hear our call for the establishment of this commission of inquiry where victims can finally access truth, justice and reparations, something that has become impossible in their own country.
Francisco, as we move this forward, the Norwegians are trying to mediate in Oslo. Reports of talks, maybe not direct face-to-face, maybe not at the highest level, but there's some sort of dialogue going on. And then we heard Maduro proposing early elections for the National Assembly, which Guaido currently heads, and that's why opposition supporters call him the president. Are you willing to try and compromise with Maduro?
I think that's the wrong question. I think, one, you have to look at the facts and you see how the regime is systematically killing its citizens. You have to ask, the only possible discussion right now is how Maduro is able to leave power and open the doors for democratic forces and democratic renovation. Any sort of discussion or communication, as President Guaido has clearly stated, will be in that regard. In the meantime, more pressure needs to be put on the regime. For example, we have asked the European Union to increase more individual sanctions on people who systematically violate human rights or outright engage in criminal activity. This is what's going on in Venezuela. So, we have to understand dialogue processes started in 2014. In fact, they started in 2002, but since 2014 with Maduro, what have we gotten between 2014 and 2019 with 3 or 4 dialogue processes? Well, we've gotten more political prisoners. We've gotten a 40% GDP drop. We've gotten 3 million Venezuelans outside of Venezuela. So the democratic forces, again, not the opposition, have been consistently trying to find a peaceful and constitutional solution. But unfortunately, Maduro has been the biggest blockage for peace in Venezuela. We are right now living war-like consequences. Maduro is the most destructive force in its regime in the history of Venezuela, more than any war we faced. And so we have to understand and raise a threat to the international community of what's going on. And frankly, the disregard for the UN system by Maduro is devastating. The last time, and I'll finish with this, there was a UN representatives of the Human Rights Council. They put in prison the chief of staff of interim President Guaido. That's how much they really care about that situation. So more pressure needs to be put on Maduro, and the continued support of the international community for President Guaido is something that we're definitely looking to expand.
Paul, is Francisco wrong?
Well, I'm not surprised to hear these comments from him. He's obviously one of the close circle of the coup-monger Juan Guaido, the man who was never elected president, but who declared himself to be president. So this is understandable that Francisco has this opinion. I think it's very important that we look at the attitude assumed by the authorities here in Venezuela. For example, when the commission came from the United Nations Human Rights Council, the doors were opened. They had numerous high-level meetings with a range of authorities, as well as extra government movements, social groups, NGOs, general citizenship, and so on. And they weren't denied any information or any possibility to do a full objective report. and I think this is very important. When we look at the political context in which this is currently happening, as you pointed out in your initial question, it is very difficult for the international community to really take forward any action should they decide to do so. But I think any action should really be based on, firstly, respect for Venezuela's constitution and the choice of the Venezuelans, which is made very clear. And secondly, the effort's been made by both sides. No solution, no mediation is really going to have any sort of effort or any sort of effect should both sides not assume their compromise in doing this.
Quick response from you, Francisco.
I didn't hear Paul contradict any single one of my facts, only characterized me in a very wrong way. He didn't talk about the 1,000 political prisoners. And again, he doesn't respond to the fact that while the UN was there, they put in prison the chief of staff of President Guaido. So, by the way, on May 20th, over 60 countries and the majority of the region and OAS did not recognize the fraudulent election of Maduro. That's not even a dispute anymore by most people. So, and Juan Guaido was legitimately elected through a constitution. But moreover, regardless of what you think of Guaido, Venezuelan people are suffering, and the regime is the cause. And so anybody who supports them, quite frankly, I don't know how they sleep at night.
Carolina, very finally, what is quite clear, no matter where you stand on this, is that the humanitarian situation has deteriorated in Venezuela over the past few years. You only have to follow the traffic. As was mentioned, 4 million people have left the country. If there's anyone from the Venezuelan government watching this program, what would be your direct message to them, Carolina?
First of all, stop the strategy of repression. It is already incredibly difficult for people, to deal with scarcity, to deal with the lack of medicines, to deal with the hyperinflation. On top of that, to have to deal with being silenced, with their children being executed, is the most horrible thing that can happen to a family. It is time for all Venezuelans to come together and put an end to these systematic attacks and this terrible human rights crisis that is affecting millions of Venezuelans every single day.
Carolina, Francisco, and Paul, I thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.